Hey, Shroud of Turin fans. Hope you're doing well. Today I am here with Real Seekers. We've done this several times talking about the Shroud, and each time we're taking a different angle. And so, in case you don't know what the Shroud of Turin is, it is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And we're going to present some evidence in favor of that. We'll also focus on the medieval times and exactly what we knew about the Shroud during those times. And so, without further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to Dale. Dale, say hello to everybody and let them know who you are.
Yeah, hey, Stephanie, thanks for having me back. You've put up with me at least twice now, so this is our third time. So, yeah, we're continuing on with the Shroud series that we've set up. And last time we kind of looked at one of the Shroud skeptics' theories, the proto-photo hypothesis, and kind of debunked that and proved that, yeah, you can't explain the Shroud's body and bloodstain images using that method. And I wanted to move on onto the traditional painting hypothesis because this was the first Shroud skeptical hypothesis that existed. But with that one, there's not just scientific evidence. So I'm going to save my scientific analysis for next show. But there's also some historical evidence that supposedly supports the painting hypothesis. And that's what I wanted to look at here is kind of give a brief glimpse of the medieval history, proposed medieval history for the Shroud, and also address this D'Arcy Memorandum from 1389 that claims the Shroud is a medieval painted fake. So that's the plan for today.
Yeah, wonderful. And are we going to be talking about the Hungarian Prey Codex as well?
We are not. I'm saving that for a future episode. But yeah, this period is specifically between 1204 to about 1390. That's what we're talking about today.
Okay, good. And actually that's a coincidence because that period of time is right around the same window where the carbon dating from 1988 took place. So from 1260 to 1390 is when the supposed carbon dating was taking place. But we've already gone over that and shown why that is unlikely to be the true dating. But so that's going beyond the scope of today. But let me go ahead and just turn it over to you. And I understand, Dale, that you also have some visuals. So anything you want to share, just feel free to bring it all in.
I do. All right, cool. So let me share the screen. And is that popping up there?
Yeah, I don't know. Here at the stream. Let's see. There we go.
You're seeing it, Shroud. Perfect. So the first thing I wanted to do, obviously, everyone kind of agrees, whether you're pro Shroud or Shroud skeptic, we all agree that the Shroud showed up sometime in the mid 1350s. So 1355 to 1357, in and around there. Everyone agrees that's when the Shroud is undisputed to have showed up in Leary, France. Obviously, if you're pro-Shroud, well, you believe that the Shroud predates that and goes all the way back to the time of Jesus. So there is a historical gap period between 1204 to 1356. And that's what I want to be looking at some of the hypotheses that pro-Shroud people have come up with to explain where the Shroud was during this specific period, this gap period. So in the first place, as I said, we have our ending point in the 1350s when Geoffrey I de Charny first exhibited the Shroud in Leary, France. Everybody agrees with that, skeptics and pro-Shroud. But pro-Shroud guys, they believe that there was a starting point. The Shroud was in Constantinople as the burial Shroud, at least as of 1203 or 1204, when the Fourth Crusade took place and the Latins or Franks sacked the city and the Shroud was lost from there, type thing. So that's what we're looking at today. So in the first place, there is certain relevant historical data that we're going to use to assess three of these hypotheses. So the first is the fact that after 1204, after the sack of Constantinople, the Shroud was not referenced at all, or possibly there are one or two mentions of it. There's no explanation for how Geoffrey I de Charny got the Shroud. Where did he get it from? The only thing that we're told is that it was freely given to him. So he didn't buy it. It wasn't sold to him for money. That's all we know about how Geoffrey got it. And finally, in 1343, Geoffrey I, this is the year he becomes a knight, And it's in this year that he asks King Philip for financial help to build that church in Leary. And the reason this is significant is because Leary is nowheresville. This is a very tiny, even today, there's less than 200 people, I think, living in Leary, France, if I remember properly. So this is why would someone build a church out in the middle of nowheresville? One of the things is maybe because he had the Shroud and he needed to build a church to showcase it. Okay, so outside of those data points, we have 5 relevant historical texts during this period. So the first is the famous quote by Robert de Clary. This was made in August 1203. He was one of the crusaders, French crusaders, who went to Constantinople. And he basically gives us a quote in August talking about how his fellow crusaders captured and sacked Constantinople. Before that, he had seen in the city a church which was called My Lady Saint Mary of Blachernay, where there was the cindoin in which our Lord had been wrapped, which every Friday stood upright so that one could see the figure of our Lord on it. And then in his chronicle after the sacking, he goes on and adds an extra paragraph to this and says, no one, either Greek or French, ever knew what became of this cindoin when the city was taken. So that's our first text that Pro-Shroud guys used to establish it was in Constantinople at this time at least. But then we have additional texts. So there's Geoffrey de Villardouin. He also was a crusader and wrote a chronicle. And as of 1204, after the sacking, he says, he mentions that before the sack happened, the leaders of the crusade went into the city and they garrisoned the 2 palaces where these Passion relics were being held, including the Shroud, and they protected that from the looters. Next, we have Nicholas of Otranto, and he gives a report as of 1207, where he lists off the palace relics after the sacking, and these include the burial cloth relic. It's also in his Nicholas Mazarite's eulogy. So he died again his brother John died in 1207. And he also mentions the Othnia and the Sudariums, or shrouds, of Jesus still remained in Constantinople as of 1207 under the Latin emperors there.
Now, let me just tune in here real quick.
Sure.
Joe Marino just posted something. He's got a link to a paper, and it looks like it's very relevant to this time period. So anyone, please go to that link. The other thing, just to really highlight here, that as you're pointing out these dates and how important these dates are, is because let's not forget that the carbon dating that some people claimed came between 1260, far after these sightings of the Shroud, and 1390. And so that also is not supporting the carbon dating, which 6 academic papers have recently looked into and found out that this carbon dating was completely bunk. So anyway, okay, I just want to point that out.
Yeah, cool. I can't see. I'll look at Joe's comment before, but right now because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see anything. But yeah, and one thing I should mention, so there is a difference here when we get to the hypotheses, right? So certain hypotheses don't use these texts. They base just on the Robert de Clary one, and they say, well, the Shroud disappeared during the sacking. So some hypothesizers, they'll say, well, the Shroud disappeared in the sack, and then they have their hypothesis who took it. Other pro-Shroud proponents will use these texts and say, well, no, the Shroud remained in Constantinople under the care of the Latin emperors. So that'll become clear as I kind of move on. But yeah, first I just want to name what is the evidence we have to look at.
And so let's back up just for a second, just so people realize this. So the Shroud obviously initially was in Jesus's tomb in Jerusalem. When did it go, in your estimation? Like, let's kind of travel through history really quickly. How did it find its way into Constantinople? Do we know that before it went over to France?
Okay, so that's the subject for another show, but just very briefly, I'll say that there are at least 2 or 3 main pro-Shroud hypotheses as to how it got. So the main one that you espouse, Stephanie, and most pro-Shroud proponents espouse this, is image of Edessa theory. So, from Jesus, it was taken to Edessa at some point early in the first century, and it became lost to history for about 500 years, 540 years or so. And then it was rediscovered, and it was held in Edessa until about 944 AD, and that's when it came to Constantinople, and it was held there until 1204.
Okay, super interesting. Thank you for that, and just clarifying that.
No problem. And there is another theory. My friend Jack Markwart, he says no, the image of Edessa is not the shroud. It was what was called the image of God incarnate, and that has an alternative history that I'll cover in another show. But for right now, no matter what hypothesis you take, everyone agrees the shroud was in Constantinople as of 1204. So
okay,
that's the pro-shroud starting point. Cool. Yeah, and then we also have a golden bull. This was under the French or Latin Emperor Baldwin II, and he kind of lists about 22 relics that he had that he transferred to King Louis IX of France, who was the saintly king, and he'll become relevant later. However, this one is iffy whether it refers to the shroud as a whole or just a piece of the shroud. Okay, so these are all the facts that we're dealing with. So let's get into some of the historical hypotheses here. To date, there have been a total of 16 pro-shroud historical hypotheses that talk about where the shroud was from 1204 up until the mid-1350s. There are three main types of theories. So there are text-based theories. So these are theories that incorporate all five of these texts and take them as true. And then they account for it where the shroud was based on these texts. Then there are ad hoc based theories. So these are theories that are founded upon an unproven speculation. So, for example, I mentioned some people think the shroud totally disappeared after the sack of Constantinople in 1204. So this is known as the disappearance aspect. There's also the Smyrna aspect. So some people speculate, oh, well, he went off and fought a crusade in Smyrna and acquired the shroud there. There's no evidence for that. It's just a speculation. So these are examples that are called ad hoc or fiction-based theories. And then finally, there are a few forgery-based theories. So these are theories that are based on in my opinion, a proven forged letter known as the Theodore Letter. And yeah, you base your theory based on that. So that's the categorization. And you can see I've kind of just listed the 16 theories. The ones in green are historically plausible. So you can see we have a few here. These are the ad hoc things. So we've got a couple of plausible ones here. And finally, we have 4 forgery-based theories. All of them, because they're based on a forgery, they're just automatically implausible. So yeah, let's look at 3 of these theories. So we're going to assess it.
Let me ask you just really quickly, where did you get are these coming from academic journals, or where are the theories coming from?
Absolutely. So my friend, Shroud historian Jack Markwart, he actually consults all of the academic peer-reviewed journals and historians, and that's what he based his own hypothesis on. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
I'll probably invite him on one of these shows to tackle someone on this if you want. But cool. So this is how we're gonna assess these 3 hypotheses in light of the plausibility, explanatory scope, explanatory power, and less ad hoc. Okay, so the first one, this is probably the one that you know yourself, Stephanie. It's probably the most popular of all the theories, the Knights Templar theory. So this is the notion by historian Ian Wilson in 1978. And he basically said, look, the shroud in 1204, it was in Constantinople. We have Robert de Clary referencing it there. But then in the chaos, it was stolen by some unknown person. It was looted and taken from Constantinople by one of the Crusaders. And in some way, it was given or transferred to the Knights Templars, and they held it in the Holy Land until 1291, I believe, when Acre fell to the Muslims. And okay, once the Knights Templars had to leave the Holy Land, they took the shroud with them to protect it back to France. And that's how it ended up in France. And guess what? In the early 1300s, the King of France turned against the Templars and he started persecuting and killing these guys as heretics. One of the Templars, the last ones, is a guy named Geoffrey de Charnay. And it's postulated, oh, well, okay, Geoffrey de Charnay, that's the same name as the first guy in the 1350s, Geoffrey the First de Charnay, who first exhibited the shroud. So maybe they must have been related, and it was, Geoffrey the First inherited it. So that's, in a nutshell, the Knights Templar theory. Is that making sense so far, Stephanie?
Yeah. So just so the crowd knows, if you guys, I want to say Joe Marino has done extensive work on the Shroud. So if you guys aren't on his email list, you've got to get yourselves onto it. You might want to let him know your email address, or Joe, if you want to drop your email address in here. And also, you guys want to make sure you subscribe to Real Seekers channel. I've put a link that Shiami was good enough to post right there in the thing, so you can go in there and subscribe to Dale's channel and learn more about this stuff. But what he's doing now, just so you know, he's explaining a period of time when we didn't know exactly what happened to the Shroud. There's kind of a window of time, and he's just giving us some theories on that.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm doing at this moment. So perfect. Okay, cool. So are there any specific facts that could be used to support the Knights Templar theory directly? And there are 4 possible candidates. So only the first 2 work. So the fact is, Ian Wilson has documented that in various interrogations, look, the Knights Templar, they had a secret initiation ceremonies and rituals, one of which was supposedly venerating or worshiping a head idol. It was described to be terrifying and awesome. And this thing, to them, it represented God's presence on earth in a way that was so remarkable that they said, the heck with Mass. I mean, imagine Roman Catholics saying that we don't need to follow Mass. We've got this thing instead. And this is more important. This is more symbolic of God's presence, right? So what is it these Templars are worshiping, the pro-Shroud guys? Well, the head idol, that's the Shroud of Turin. And there's been archaeological proof at the Temple Combe panel, which is basically a celestial head of Jesus, and it's an artistic depiction, and I'll show that here, of the head idol that the Knights Templars worshipped and venerated based on the Shroud of Turin, according to this theory. There are a couple of other things that I think are weaker. So Barbara Frail was an archivist at the Vatican, and she claimed she found a document in 2008 that actually talked about during this initiation thing, it had the long linen cloth on which was imprinted the figure of a man. My goodness, this is like knockdown proof that it's the Shroud of Turin, right? But unfortunately, this letter has been falsified. The translation has been shown to be wrong, that she did. And even Ian Wilson himself has critiqued this line of evidence. But finally, we have, remember the name similarity. Remember Geoffrey de Charnay, the Knights Templar, the one of the last known Knights Templars who would have possibly had the Shroud of Turin. Well, that's the same as Geoffrey the First de Charnay. Does that link the two? Well, again, the names are very common. Geoffrey is a common name, and Charnay is just a place. So, despite over 40 years of this hypothesis being out there, there's been no direct proof that both these Geoffrey de Charnays are in fact related. So that's the theory-specific evidence. So I'll just kind of assess it very quickly. So in terms of historically plausible, given our background knowledge, this is fully plausible. I don't see any way to say that we can rule this theory out based on plausibility alone. In terms of explanatory scope, this is a weakness of the Knights Templar theory, because remember, it accounts for Robert de Clary's chronicle, but then it says in 1204, the shroud disappeared. It was stolen by an unknown person, and it just disappeared from history during these missing years period. So it doesn't account for those other texts that talk about the shroud still being in Constantinople after 1204. In terms of explanatory power, this does have a good explanatory power. It does explain, why the shroud isn't really mentioned, because it disappeared after 1204. It also explains why there was silence in terms of how Geoffrey the First got the shroud, because you don't want to admit that you inherited it from a bunch of heretics with the Knights Templars and idol worshippers and stuff. That's embarrassing. So you want to keep, mum's the word type deal. Obviously, it was freely given because under this theory, he inherited it from his dad or something. Go ahead.
Yeah, let's explain who that, because the Knights Templar, it's my understanding this is part of the Freemasonry group. Is that true?
I don't think
the Freemasons, the Knights Templar Freemasons, because Freemasons is a group that's specifically condemned by Mother Mary multiple times in apparitions, just to point that out. So I'm really interested in this idea, and I could see the point where you just were making, that the Knights Templar could be it could be an embarrassment if that is the case.
Yeah, so from my understanding, I don't know much about the Freemasons, but they come later in history.
No, they started actually around this time, but then they were official like in the 1700s.
Okay. Well, the Knights Templar basically are an independent group. They were a bunch of crusaders that went on the first crusade, and they took it upon their mission to kind of protect pilgrims coming to the Holy Land and stuff, and protect relics and stuff like that. So yeah, they died out.
Thank you. That's very helpful if it's not the same. Thank you.
No problem. Cool. And guess what? It also explains Geoffrey's 1343 plan to build a church out in the middle of Nowheresville in Leary, because he would have inherited it before that date. And the only ad hoc element here is, again, without any evidence, it has to assume that the Geoffrey de Charny, who was a Knights Templar and burnt at the stake in the early 1300s, is related to Geoffrey the First de Charny. In terms of peer review, there's been several scholars, pro-Shroud scholars even, and secular historians who've kind of critiqued this theory and that sort of thing. But that's my assessment. Anything on the Knights Templar theory, or are you good to move on?
I'm good. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I like how you've lined this up with plausibility, scope, power. I like that.
Awesome. Yeah, you need a systematic way to kind of assess these, right? Because at the end of the day, I think that we can't really directly prove that any of these hypotheses are in fact true directly. I think that what you would need to do if you want to make a positive argument on this front is do an abductive argument, an inference to the best explanation. That's the only way I can see it working. So, yep, that's why I'm doing this. All right, cool. So here's the theory that I myself sort of lean towards, and it's by Jack Marquardt, who I mentioned to you before. And this is one of the newest theories. He just published this in 2017. And he basically says, well, look, no, the Shroud stayed in Constantinople after 1204, and it was a relic held by the Latin emperors. There are, a series of about 4 Latin emperors, ending with Baldwin II in, the between 1230s to 1261. And that's when the Greeks retook over Constantinople, the Byzantines. Now, Baldwin II, he essentially was bankrupted. He had no money. He was desperate to raise money, but everyone kind of thought he was a loser, and no one wanted to lend him the money for whatever reason. So my goodness, what was he supposed to do? Well, he started to sell off his relics, because that was the thing that he had. And we know for a fact, given that golden papal bull from 1247, that he gave a total of 22 of them to King Louis IX of France, who's the only king who was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church in France. And between 1239 and 1241, he was giving these relics to the king. But there was a problem here, because obviously Baldwin, well, you're going to give me money in exchange, right? But this is the sin of simony. Buying and selling holy relics is actually a mortal sin, and kings could lose their throne. They would be excommunicated. You can't give money for a relic or a passion relic or something like that. So what these guys did, they came up with a relic scheme, basically, where they said, okay, I know what we'll do. Baldwin, I will borrow money from the Venetians. The Venetians were heretics. They were excommunicated because of their actions at the Fourth Crusade, taking stuff and looting stuff. So the Pope had excommunicated the Venetians at this point. So he's like, I'll borrow money from these people, the Venetians, and then I'll put up as collateral one of the relics. And there basically there's an exception clause, right? So you are allowed to use money to save a relic from falling into the hands of an infidel or a heretic. If it'll save it, then you're allowed to do it, right? So Baldwin would purposefully default on the loans, and then then he would say, "Oh my gosh, King Louis, I need help. I'm going to lose this relic to these heretic Venetians. Please give me the money. Pay the Venetians the money that I owe them. And in exchange, as a reward, I will give you this relic." So it kind of avoided technically the sin of simony. And this is something that we know they did historically for at least 22 relics. Now, with the Shroud of Turin, what happened there is that the king went on a crusade, and Baldwin's son, I think his name was Philip, was captured by the Muslims in Egypt. And they held him for a king's ransom. And obviously Baldwin didn't have the money. So who does he go to? He goes to King Louis, and he says, "Look, again, you can get the Shroud of Turin, the Shroud. I'll give you the Shroud if you pay off this ransom." And King Louis was like, "Okay, well, this isn't the sin of simony, because I'm being a good guy. I'm trying to save a Christian from these infidels in Egypt who are holding him hostage and stuff like that." So, okay, he forks over the money, and in exchange gets the Shroud of Turin, or gets the Shroud, sorry. And the problem was this did qualify as simony. So what would have happened is, under this theory, he would have gotten the Shroud, but his lawyers would have advised that, you've got to get rid of it. This is not the same as before. This counts as simony. So what is he supposed to do? He can't throw out a passion relic. So what he did is he gave it to his friend John de Joinville, and he was the owner of Leary as of 1290. And John de Joinville, he gave it to his daughter as dower property. Dower property is given to the woman to retain independently of the husband and that sort of thing. And she dies in 1306. She dies very young. So she left her dower property to Geoffrey I de Charny, who was the first exhibitor of the Shroud in the 1350s. So yeah, I'll just do a quick assessment of this theory. So this theory is fully historically plausible given our background knowledge. It fits the knowledge of these two schemers in terms of the relics. It fits Louis's lust for gaining holy relics from Constantinople. It also fits knowledge that we didn't even know about until 1996, namely that Geoffrey I de Charny was actually related to Joinville. He was his grandson. Okay, and in terms of explanatory scope, this is a text-based theory, so it accounts for all 5 of those relevant texts, including the ones talking about the Shroud being in Constantinople after 1204. Explanatory power, it has good explanatory power. It explains why it was freely given as dower property from his mom as an inheritance. It was given to him prior to 1343, so as soon as Geoffrey I becomes a knight and has the ability to create the church, he goes ahead and does it because he wants to showcase the Shroud. It explains why there would be silence, because think about it, it would be embarrassing, if somebody says, "Well, look, I got this from my mom." Well, where'd your mom get it from? From John de Joinville, the king's best buddy. Where did he get it from? He got it from the King St. Louis. Well, how did the king get it? Simony. Oops, now you have a canonized saintly king mixed up in mortal sins, and that doesn't look right. So that's why it would have been kept hush-hush under this theory. And there's no ad hoc elements and stuff to this, and hasn't been any peer review yet. So let me just pause there. Any questions about the simony theory at all, or?
Yeah, if it is considered a sin to do this, to pay for this relic, and he was canonized a saint, that does add a little bit of questionable material to it, the theory itself, because I'm just wondering, how would they not know or find out about if he really did that? But I can see your idea that they kind of did it in this weird wraparound way where maybe he wouldn't be guilty of it. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And this is, in terms of the 22 relics, this is historical fact, right? Like nobody denies that they found this workaround way, and nobody charged the king with simony. It was not a problem. But with the Shroud in particular, under this hypothesis, Louis paid the money directly as a ransom to the Muslims of Egypt to try and free this Philip, the hostage there. And that didn't work, right? So his lawyers, once he did it, and his advisors immediately told him, no, you have to get rid of this thing because this doesn't work as a workaround. So yeah.
Interesting.
All right, cool. All right. So those are two pro-Shroud historical hypotheses. Let's look at the best Shroud skeptical hypothesis for where the Shroud was during this period. And for that, I want to look at Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry, his Quem Queritas hypothesis. And basically, he also has a gap period because he believes that, look, it's impossible to highly improbable, given the carbon-14 data, that the Shroud would have been made between 1320 to 1350s. That just doesn't fit the data. It's the best carbon-14 dates would be somewhere between 1270 and 1310. So Hugh Ferry says he thinks the Shroud was made in the 1290s. Yeah, I'll quickly play his explanation for about 8 minutes here. So hang on.
I'm worried if you do put that on, are you sure we can do that? Because remember, Dale, how we had to cut that other one out?
So this one is my video, and I give copyright permission to show it. So
perfect.
Right.
Good.
Great, cool. So
wait, but let me start.
Can you hear that?
Yes.
Okay.
Argue with what I just said. Could you explain to me the non-authenticist point of view, the history of the Turin Shroud from the time that it was created, with as much specificity as you can give, to the time that it appears in Liray for exhibition?
Yep. From our point of view, it is total supposition. But I think it's sensible supposition, and I'll explain, well, you'll understand why it's a sensible supposition, even if you disagree with it. I've got no history like Robert de Clary, who says he saw an image of, well, no, who says that he has knowledge of an image
there, yeah,
up and down. However, this is the non-authenticist position, if you like, and that is the Quem Queritis ceremony, of which you will be familiar because it was enacted first of all on Easter Sunday and later on Corpus Christi as well, the Feast of Corpus Christi. After that was instituted, it was enacted in literally thousands of churches, literally all over Europe. Now, we know that because it's found in the use of Hereford, it's found in the use of Sarum, it's found in missals and books of liturgy all over Europe. And I forget his name, but a wonderful German wrote a 7-volume book tabulating 400 or 500 different versions of the Quem Queritis liturgy, which he picked up from medieval manuscripts all over Europe. It's in one of my books, and I can find it out later. So we know that this ceremony was enacted. It was enacted in churches, big ones and small ones, all over the place. It involved an Easter sepulchre, which was either a wooden box which you could bring out for the occasion, or right up to something that was built into the wall of the church. And of course, those medieval churches which still remain, a lot of them still have them. You can see the Easter sepulchres built into the side of the church. So the ceremony definitely existed. Now, in a fair proportion of those liturgies, the three clerics dressed as holy women, funnily enough, go across to the Easter sepulchre where they meet another cleric who's dressed as an angel, and the angel that they are, the angel says, "Quem queritis?" Who are you looking for? They say, "We're looking for Jesus." The angel says he's not here, but here is his shroud, normally written as a lintaminea, and the clerics then take that to the high altar and display it to the congregation, or if it's a monastery, they display it to the monks. So all over Europe, there were shrouds. That's, I think, fairly incontestable. What we don't know, of course, is what they look like or whether they had anything on them. None of these shrouds exist, except possibly the Shroud of Besançon, which was destroyed in the French Revolution, and possibly the Shroud of Turin, which is what I maintain. So I think that this the shroud was made. It's an expensive piece of material. It's a huge piece of material. So it wasn't made for display in a village church. It was made for display in either an abbey or a cathedral. I've no idea which abbey and which cathedral, I'm afraid, but that's the possibility that I'm aiming for. Now, for one reason or another, it was discontinued. One reason may have been that it got terribly stained. One reason may have been that they got dirty and they washed it and the image practically disappeared. All these are speculations, but there are reasons for it. It was then given to somebody else. Now, it might have been given to Geoffrey de Charny, or it might have been given to the Dean of Leary. Either of them knew exactly what it was. It was an old shroud that had been used for the Quem Quiritis ceremony in a large cathedral. It might have been Melun Cathedral. It might even have been a Carthusian abbey, not far away from Troy itself. The name of the abbey escapes me at the moment. Was it Melun? There's another one. Anyway, but there are various possibilities.
Okay, so I think you guys kind of get the hint. Do you have any questions about what this Quem Quiritas theory is?
Yeah, I do. I want to try to break this down because, first place, I think there's a few points. So he basically is saying that it was created in the medieval times. He conveniently places it right in the carbon-14 dating from 1988. And he says that there was supposedly this shroud was used in this particular, was it a ceremony or
an Easter ceremony? So basically
Easter ceremony. So they used it. He doesn't know where exactly it was used, but he says it was a shroud. It was created. He doesn't give an explanation for how it was created, how the image got on the shroud. That's beyond this theory. His theory is just saying that the shroud was carried around from location to location during a celebration.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of the history thing, he is basically just saying, look, there were many shrouds going on with this Quem Quiritas Easter ceremony that happened all over Europe, according to him. Jack Markward's actually looking into that and finding some challenges, but I'll wait to see what his research says on that. But yeah, according to Hugh, there was this Easter ceremony involving a shroud whereby the three clergymen would dress up as women, and the three women, and then an angel would say, Jesus is not here. Here, look, here's his shroud. And they would show the shroud to the congregation. That's what that ceremony is. And what Hugh's hypothesis is, well, the Shroud of Turin was one of those shrouds that somehow got images on it and stuff like that. So that's his hypothesis, whereby it was discarded and given to Geoffrey I to show in his small church.
Yeah, I don't find that is very compelling, actually, to say he knows it was the shroud itself, and it's just that went around, because what support does he have that says that they used the real shroud in this ceremony, or that they were just shrouds? Because shroud is just another word for linen cloth. So all it is a long linen cloth, and certainly they did have those. The interesting thing, though, is in medieval times they were mainly using cotton and not linen, which is what was used in the shroud. And there's a number of other factors that you could do to discount some of those theories that it was created in medieval times.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there are a lot of problems with this hypothesis if we evaluate it the same way we did. So in terms of historical plausibility, I mentioned that there is some questions. Jack is working on that, but I said that it's plausible because there was indeed this ceremony that does seem to have been going on, and it involves what Hugh is saying for the most part. So great. It's plausible. But in terms of explanatory scope, it ignores all of the relevant texts that we had, right? Because it posits that the shroud didn't even exist to be mentioned. So in that case, what the heck are all these texts in 1204 and 1207 and 1247? What are they talking about? Does it just happen to be another shroud or something like that? Again, he hasn't mentioned in his hypothesis here, and you can't just ignore these texts. Explanatory power. It's pretty weak here too. So it doesn't. It can explain Geoffrey's 1343 plan because Hugh posits the shroud being made in 1290. So as long as Geoffrey got the shroud before 1343, it can explain that fact. But it fails to explain why on earth would there be silence in terms of how Geoffrey got the shroud. There's nothing embarrassing if he got it from a bigger church like an abbey or a monastery or something like that. When they discarded it, why would you have to keep that a secret? There's no reason to hide it. Just say, yeah, I got it from down the street over there. And it doesn't fit the fact that, look, none of the texts that Hugh is appealing to for this Quem Queritas ceremony, none of them talk about anything about images being on these linen cloths at all. So that's an inconsistency there. And even Hugh admits, he's got no evidence supporting this. It's pure speculation. So, in a way, the whole theory is kind of ad hoc there. So that's my assessment of Hugh's hypothesis there. Any questions on that, or?
Yeah, no, I didn't. That one I didn't find very convincing. The other two are interesting, though. The other two that you think are more plausible, those seem a little more interesting to me, because I think also, just to be fair to what we have about the shroud and what we know about the shroud, and some of the reasons why people date it all the way back to the 1st century, is because they identified pollens and oils and things that were consistent with Jerusalem in that time period. And also through history, the art that people see, like the Hungarian Prey Codex that was around 1191, again preceding the carbon dating window, and the similarities in the Hungarian Prey Codex to the image on the cloth and the herringbone even. So that's just something else to note. There's so many things that a theory that says that the shroud was developed in that year, it doesn't pay attention to. Or even the Sudarium of Oviedo, where if you line up that cloth, which was the cloth that Jesus used to wipe his face, with the shroud, the image, it lines up. It's consistent. And that was dated way, way before all of this.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm kind of bracketing out all of those things for my purposes here, just looking at the period 1204, the evidence from 1204 to the 1356 or thereabouts. But yeah, you're right. If you add in all the other evidence from the prior centuries, like the Prey Codex or the Sudarium and that stuff, it just even exposes the lie to the Shroud skeptics even further. But yeah, in this presentation, I've just bracketed that out, and I still think we can make the case that those pro-Shroud hypotheses are superior in terms of fulfilling these criteria compared to what the Shroud skeptics have. It's mostly just unproven speculation with no evidence at all, really directly speaking to it at all.
Yeah, and even when you think about just the massive number of people in all different fields who've studied the Shroud, and who still today, 2023, have no idea how the image got on there. Some have posited different sort of this sort of a, what do you call it, like radiation that's consistent with what they saw over in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that put images on these walls over there of the humans who were unfortunately burned at that time. But the interesting thing is they still don't know. They still don't know. And as I heard in that other video that I watched today, 372 independent wounds were marked on there, just showing the person who was crucified, the extreme gore that he had to go through, not only being whipped on his back, but being whipped all over his body, which was horrible. And so you can just see the literal blood of Jesus for us in our salvation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree. All right, awesome. Well, I have my part 2, if you don't mind. So this is where we're going to get into, I don't know where we are with timing yet.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm good with part 2.
All right, cool. And no questions from part 1 from the audience at all?
Yeah, if you guys have any questions. Nikki says that, I think the third theory, she calls it the weak sauce theory.
Take that, Hugh. There he goes. Yeah, it's the Shroud skeptics really, they're good. They like nitpicking the pro-Shroud side, putting all the work on the pro-Shroud side to come up with these hypotheses and try to find evidence, and they'll nitpick and say, oh, well, this doesn't work, or I don't like this is a weak thing. But turn the table, put the shoe on the other foot and say, okay, skeptic, you come up with a hypothesis where you explain how the Shroud was formed and where it was during this period. And you can see how weak it is compared to what the Pro Shroud guys have. So yeah, I think that's
yeah. And it's pretty neat just to point this out. Sometimes people don't realize, like the Sudarium of Oviedo, the cloth that Jesus used, that was mentioned in John 20, verses 6 and 7. And the shroud, the clean linen shroud, that's the quote that was right in Matthew 27:59. And so this is all biblical too.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. All right, cool. Well, guess what? We've been talking some smack and some trash against Shroud skeptics, but look, this is where the Shroud skeptic. Now, if we look beyond the 1350s, we have this infamous 1389 D'Arcy Memorandum. And this is where some Shroud skeptics will say, ha, see, we've got proof, not only that the Shroud is medieval in origin, but that it was painted by an artist in the medieval period. And we even have the artist who made the Shroud confessing to it. So here's Bishop Pierre D'Arcy. He was the Bishop of Troyes, which is right near Leary, the city near Leary. And in 1389, he says this about the Shroud. He says, my predecessor, the Lord Henry de Poitiers, of pious memory, then Bishop of Troyes, becoming aware of this and urged by many prudent persons to take action, as indeed was his duty in the exercise of his ordinary jurisdiction, set himself earnestly to work to fathom the truth of this matter. And just to explain the context, so the matter is Geoffrey II, Geoffrey Jr., in the 1380s is exhibiting the Shroud again, just like his dad did in the 40 years earlier. He's re-exhibiting it, and Bishop Pierre D'Arcy doesn't like this. He doesn't like that he's exhibiting the Shroud, so he's trying to get that stopped. And he's saying in this quote that his predecessor, Henry of Poitiers, the Bishop Henry, he also had a problem against Geoffrey I showing the Shroud in the 1350s. So that's the context. And he says, eventually, after diligent inquiry and examination, Bishop Henry discovered the fraud and how the said cloth had been cunningly painted, the truth being attested to by the artist who had painted it, to wit, that it was a work of human skill and not miraculously wrought or bestowed. So this is some damning seeming positive evidence, right? That this thing makes 7 claims against the Pro Shroud side, only 2 of which are relevant to the traditional painting hypothesis. But, for example, he says Robert de Caelic, he was the dean of Leary in the 1350s, procured the Shroud out of greed, just trying to make money by showing it to these pilgrims from around the world, that the Shroud images were cunningly painted. The dean exhibited the Shroud and represented it as Jesus's actual burial shroud, knowing that it wasn't, to induce people from all parts of the world to come and venerate it. Also, the Bishop Henry de Poitiers conducted an official inquiry where the artist confessed to having painted the Shroud in 1355 or thereabouts. And yeah, there are other claims there. But so, yeah, this, like I said, this is seemingly at face value some damning evidence against the Pro Shroud guys. So how do we assess this D'Arcy Memorandum? Okay, so in the first place, we have to understand all of the extant copies of this memo are unsigned and undated drafts. It basically means this thing was never officially sent. It's not an official document. It's not in the Vatican archives. It's not even signed and dated. And it's not even upgraded with, in the medieval period, whenever you wrote to the Pope, you had to add puffery and flattering, like, oh, you're the most holy thing that ever existed, I kiss your toes, and all this stuff, this kind of thing. It doesn't even have that. This is only a rough draft, and everyone kind of admits this. So this is a problem. This is just, at best, Bishop D'Arcy writing down his own thoughts. And even what I read there, we have 2 copies of this memorandum. What I read, that quote, there isn't a single document that has that. This is actually an amalgamation of 2 different manuscripts, one being complete and the other incomplete. So, what the Shroud skeptics are using is a heavily edited, like as of the late 1800s or early 1900s version of what this memo says.
And I want to point out what Joe Marino just said. He said D'Arcy had been a lawyer before he became a clergyman. He would know it would be imperative to give a name to the supposed artist, but he never provided one. That's a good point too.
Yeah, that's something I had coming up. So good on Joe. Exactly. This guy was a meticulous lawyer, and in all the other documents by him and stuff, they quote, they name the witnesses, they give specific dates. They don't just say, well, about 34 years ago or thereabouts. This guy has no specifics, and as a lawyer, he should. We know that they do in all the other cases. Not only that, there's questions about the translation. So one thing that's relevant here is we don't know whether the Latin actually says the artist who made the shroud confessed, or was it just an artist in general, a random artist who said that it was cunningly painted. We also have circumstantial evidence proving that D'Arcy himself had a financial motive to lie. So remember, this first shroud skeptic, he's claiming that the Leary Church is just greedy for money, and that's why they're showing the shroud. But his church experienced an earthquake, I think it was, in 1389, and he had expensive damage. And because he wasn't getting the money from the Leary Church, they were independent of his jurisdiction. He wanted to get, it seems to me that he wanted to get the shroud for himself and show it in a church where he would get the money to get repairs for this church. There are no later external records speaking about this memo at all, including in the 1600s, a guy named Nicholas Camusat did a whole history of it, including all the records from this period in the 1300s. There's no mention of this memo or an inquiry or an artist or anything like this. And finally, we have surrounding medieval documents that do not support this, and in some cases even contradict what this memo says. Okay, so any questions about that so far?
Yeah, I also would like to add, even if there is even if this is legitimate and it was really made by this person, this D'Arcy, so what? All it shows is there was some guy who was in the medieval times who was a skeptic about the shroud, and so he made up a story. I mean, that's the possibility too, which doesn't at all speak to the authenticity of the shroud. It just speaks to one guy's opinion, possibly, if it's true, if it's something he actually wrote.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. That's one of my main points when I debate this with atheists and skeptics, shroud skeptics. I will do the Gospel of Mark comparison test, and I'll say, well, look, if you're just going to mindlessly believe this guy wrote his text about 40 years after the events, if you're just going to mindlessly believe that, then I say, great, I'll throw out the shroud, but then you just mindlessly believe what's in the Gospel of Mark, because that's a document written 40 years after the events. So you just believe everything in there is true, right?
Well, they only think it's 40 years because they have to date it. They have to post date it after the time when Rome destroyed the Jerusalem temple to 70. So because Jesus predicted that was going to happen, and that really bugs certain skeptics. So they go ahead and post date everything. So
exactly. Yeah. But look, we don't even need to argue that. Let's take the worst case scenario that the skeptics go for. We can prove that they're just being hypocrites, right? Because they just take this as gospel, but then they're hypercritical against the Gospel of Mark. No, you've got to be consistent in judging these historical documents, right? Mm-hmm. So, all right, cool. Okay, so what are the relevant texts from this medieval period that are external to the memo? So from 1389 to 1390, we have several documents. So in the first place, from Pope Clement, this is a letter to Geoffrey II. De Charny, guess what? Signed and dated in the official records, right? And this is before the memo is written. So Clement basically acknowledges the De Charny's religious motives for showing the shroud, and agrees that it had been removed from the church in the 1350s and brought to safety because of the war and the pestilence, right? This is during the 100 Years' War between French and England. So they stopped showing it for a period of 30 years or so. And then Geoffrey II restarted showing it, and that's what this Bishop D'Arcy guy is reacting against. So the Pope's acknowledging, yep, it went underground for 30 years because of the war and pestilence. But look, I confirm the De Charnys have a good religious motive for showing the Shroud of Turin. He permits the showing of the cloth publicly. And he orders Bishop D'Arcy to perpetual silence. There is no mention of an inquest or an artist or a scandal of any kind that happened in the 1350s. And if this did happen, the Pope would have had to have mentioned this previous incident in his letter. It's not there because it didn't happen. Hint, hint. But okay, cool. So then we have an incident. Okay, so then Bishop D'Arcy, because he didn't have good luck with the Pope, he turns to the King of France and tries to get the King of France to steal the shroud. And okay, so the king says this, and he sends out his bailey to retrieve it. The bailey goes out, he asks for it, and they say, oh, well, the dean says they're not going to hand over the shroud, it belongs to them. And so the bailey says, okay, I'm not going to proceed further. And he comes back home and he responds to the first sergeant of the king, just kind of noting down what happened. So this is the surrounding context. Then Pope Clement, something interesting happens in January of 1390. So he writes a letter directly to Bishop D'Arcy, the guy complaining. And he says, look, in the first place, he writes his letter and he doesn't refer to the memo. This is after D'Arcy wrote the memo. So if D'Arcy sent this memo to the Pope, he would have cited it as part of this legal documentation. But he doesn't refer to it at all. Also, this letter says that the cloth was placed in the Leary's church with Clement's permission, meaning he approves of it and the showing of the shroud, despite the bishop's prohibition. And he says, look, any action trying to stop this will be met with excommunication. And he threatens D'Arcy to shut up, perpetual silence, or you'll be excommunicated. But then we get something weird. Later that same day, Clement issues a bull where he admits, look, I've changed my mind all of a sudden. And he repeats the letter, the first letter from 1389 that I quoted. So he says, D'Arcy, you are ordered to perpetual silence on pain of excommunication. But he modifies his commandment about the showing of the shroud. And he says, look, to remove any chance of error or idolatry in the display of the cloth, we ordain that you call this a figure or representation, not the authentic cloth, and you should announce that it is not the true sudarium of the Lord in a loud and clear voice, but a picture or copy only. So this seems to be backing up the information in the memo here. So this is potentially problematic. Now, a couple things just to say about this. Again, there's no proof that the Pope had ever heard of an inquiry or an artist confessing or anything like that. Instead, we have no idea why he's making this proclamation. It seems he's never seen the shroud. He doesn't have good reasons to think that it's a fake. He's just responding to the situation. And that's proven by the fact that, look, he's changing his mind on the same day. Okay, and then finally, we have a final papal bull dated June 1st, 1390. So 6 months later, Pope Clement changes his mind again in favor of the shroud. He now supports showing the Leary shroud. He makes no mention of idolatry, and he says, yeah, this is good, and we're going to enlarge the indulgences for the faithful coming to your church and showing these relics and stuff like that. So these are the surrounding medieval documents in the late 1380s surrounding the memorandum. And yeah, I think you can see there's no mention of an inquiry or an artist confessing to have cunningly painted the shroud at all. And there should be, given the custom at this time. So instead, yeah, it's just people, it looks like the Pope is just being political. He has some kind of political reason, and this is why he's waffling and changing his mind. But that's not all we have. We actually have a couple of documents dated from the 1356 to 1357. This is from the period when Geoffrey I first shows the shroud. Guess what? We have a letter from Bishop Henry de Poitiers. This is the guy that D'Arcy claims held the inquiry. And this is dated May 28, 1356. Geoffrey I died just a few months later after this, right? So, and guess what? Bishop Henry is saying, good on you, bro. I approve of everything going on at the Leary Church. I am, quote unquote, satisfied with all that has been done with the divine cult at your church. And he says he even praises, ratifies, and approves all of the goings on there. So I'm sorry, if there was an inquiry that happened prior to this, then Bishop Henry de Poitiers wouldn't be praising the divine cult going on at Geoffrey I's church. He'd be saying, you know, I condemn you, damn you for showing this fake shroud and stuff like that. But he says the exact opposite. And it would have been just time-wise impossible to hold an official inquiry in just 4 months before Geoffrey I died. So this letter contradicts the skeptic's memo written 40 years after the fact. And also there's a papal bull dated 1357, which also grants extended indulgences to the Leary Church and tells them to gain indulgences by visiting the relics that are at this church. If there was an inquiry in the year that D'Arcy says, that 1355, no, you wouldn't be getting extended indulgences at all, and telling people to go see these fake relics and stuff. So yeah, I think that kind of exposes the main problems with D'Arcy's memorandum. There's a copy of what he says in his letter. Now, there's one last objection, and here's the last slide for the audience, because I know I'm taking too long. But
oh,
okay.
No worries.
Right.
It's very interesting stuff, and I like how you've done a deep dive.
Awesome, cool. So yeah, so obviously, okay, but the documents with the Pope, right? Remember, there is that waffling. He does seem to, at least 3 times, he changes his mind. First he supports it, then he's against it, saying it's an idolatry, and then all of a sudden, 6 months later, he's again supporting the shroud. What the heck is going on in this guy's head? Is he nuts or what? Well, this is why I wanted to bring in Jack Markworth's simony theory for that gap period, because I think that this fulfills the criterion of illumination. It illuminates what's going on in this period, right? So remember, King Louis committed the sin of simony unintentionally, but he still committed the sin by obtaining the Shroud of Turin, by paying that ransom, right? And all the owners of the shroud are trying to hide this fact. And it seems that even in this period, the Pope is still cognizant of how he would have obviously held, once D'Arcy raised his complaints and this stuff was going on in the 1380s, he would have asked Geoffrey II de Charny, well, okay, what's the deal with the shroud privately? Like, where did you get it? And then he would have been given the details. So why wouldn't he say why wouldn't any of the documents, official documents, publicly say what happened? I think that they're hiding that because of the fact that it was obtained through simony from Constantinople. And there's a historical context to what's going on in the 1380s. Essentially, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, the Greek Orthodox, was raised, his mom was a Roman Catholic. And so he was partial to the Roman Catholic Church and rejoining the church. After, in 1054, there was the Great Schism where Roman Catholics divided from the Eastern Orthodox. There was an opportunity here for the two churches to unify and rejoin. And this is, secular historians acknowledge this. This is secular history. So this, I think, provides the key as to what's going on. Why is the Pope waffling back and forth? And it's because, okay, at first he supports it. He sees nothing wrong. But then he realizes, okay, I'm in negotiations with the Eastern Emperor. And if we just come out and admit, yeah, we got this thing from Constantinople, it was taken from Constantinople, the emperor's going to want it back. And I don't want to give this relic back. So that's why he orders them to just call it a figure or representation. Don't call it the actual shroud from Constantinople. I don't want to deal with those problems. But then when those negotiations fell through 6 months later, all of a sudden the Pope doesn't have that political motivation. So he says, the heck with D'Arcy, go ahead and call it the real thing. Do whatever you want, and I grant you extended indulgences and stuff like that. So, yeah,
that makes sense. That's actually pretty plausible.
Yeah, and I have a clip of Jack Markworth. It's about a 10-minute clip if you want me to play that. But any questions first before I do that? Or
I don't see any questions. If you guys have questions, be sure to post them in here. Joe Marino's posted a couple of links to some books and writings that he's done. So you guys be sure when you get a chance to go over there and take a look at that work. I'm going to do that myself. And so thank you, Joe, for posting that stuff. And I also want to say hi to other people, like we've got Nikki and Shiami and a couple others in the chat here. So thank you, everybody, for coming on in.
Awesome. All right, cool. So can you guys
Um,
can you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I've got to go quickly because I know my time is running out. It's a bit of a shame, but why did Pope Innocent VI go through all this rigmarole? Why did he conceal the authenticity of the shroud? I don't know if you've heard about the Great Schism, but the Eastern Church was divided from the Western Church. And it goes way back to 1054. It mainly had problems about papal primacy. And then after the Crusaders threw all the Greek clergy out of Constantinople, it was almost an irreparable type breach. At that time, and I have it in my paper and I have it in the slides, but I'm going to kind of quickly go through this. Church unification, this is how the church was split up in those days. Along comes this emperor. His mother was Anna of Savoy, a Roman Catholic. So he was an Eastern emperor and had to officially stay with the Orthodox Church, but he was a Catholic in every sense of the word. In fact, about 15 years after the Leray exhibitions, he went to Rome and became a Catholic. So the Pope Innocent VI, who we talked about, he was working along with Emperor John V, and he had a realistic chance to get the church put back together. But what was going to happen if he said, the Turin Shroud is an authentic relic, and I know it's an authentic relic because it can be traced back to Constantinople. The emperor would say, give us back our relic. And at that point, he would have a quandary. If he gave him back the relic, he'd be sending the relic into a war zone. That's why they were asking for military help in the first place from the Pope. And if he refused the emperor would say, I'm not going to be involved in church unification. So he came up with what I think was a rather ingenious plan to protect the relic, keep church unification going. And that was, he said, you can have your exhibitions, you can call it authentic, but I'm not putting out a papal bull because that's going to, you'll just look like you're renegades out in Leray, but I'm not going to approve it. And I think that is what happened. And I think there was another reason for the church's silence and for the imposition of perpetual silence. And that is, Geoffrey told him what had happened in terms of the St. Louis purchase. And there is no way that the Pope could say, this is authentic, and we're going to trace it back. And it went to Louis because now, where are the popes sitting? In Avignon. They're virtually captive to the French and the French church, and they're not going to take the greatest saint that they've just declared and say he committed simony. So I think that the decision was made by the papacy, give the relic, accord the relic the honor it deserves. Let's not get the Byzantines upset about things, and we will not then have to disclose the simony of St. Louis. That's what he did. I won't go into this at all, but you know, it was now another 33 years, and now there's a new pope, and his name is Pope Clement VII. Three things happen here. He approves the next set of exhibitions, ex certa scientia. That means I've got good reason to do it, but I ain't telling you. And I've just gone over what the reasons are. He knew that his predecessor had confirmed the authenticity of the shroud, and he was not going to reveal it. He was still negotiating with the Byzantine emperor, and he still had the St. Louis problem. Bishop D'Arcy is the fly in the ointment because he starts screaming that the shroud is fraudulent, so he sentences him to perpetual silence so that providence doesn't come up. And then he issues three inconsistent bulls. The first one allows the Leray clergy to say anything they want, and they do say it's authentic. The second one probably comes after the Byzantine emperor says, I want my shroud back, and then he tells the clergy in Leray, don't call it authentic, call it a copy. And then in the following June, he drops all of those requirements, and they can do anything they want again. Now, what happened? A historian would ask. In April,
between the second bull and the third bull, the emperor is overthrown. They don't have John anymore. You don't have a Catholic emperor. There goes church unification. So there's no reason to do this. So Pope Clement VII continues to conceal the authenticity of the shroud for the exact and precise reasons that Innocent did. Now, the one question, I really am very close to the end. The one question is, so he's allowing them to call it authentic in the exhibitions. Why doesn't he just call it authentic? And the reason is what I explained before. I don't think they cared about the Byzantine connection or the shroud going back to Byzantium, but you just can't come out and say it used to be a Byzantine relic and not say what happened to it in the meantime. He would have had to reveal that the King Saint of France obtained the relic through a purchase, which would be simony. So I think he.
Okay, so I think you get the point there, kind of thing. So
yeah, that was good.
That's it for my presentation. I know it was a bit longer this time, but
oh no, that was good. So I think everybody appreciates that we dove into several theories to try to, what we're doing here, just to sum up everything, was we were trying to explain what happened to the shroud. Now, the carbon dating is always put it at this time, and that's because, like you pointed out at the up front, that no one disputes the fact that the shroud was around in this period of time. Nobody disputes that. So the skeptics sometimes claim that the shroud was created, and that was one of the theories that you presented, which I think we can pretty soundly debunk. And then you presented two other theories that could show how the shroud made its way from Constantinople over to France, and why the Pope was waffling, and some other historical facts that are really interesting. And so I think that was a great presentation.
Awesome. Yeah, and bear in mind that the shroud skeptics hypothesis, that is literally the best that they've got, the best hypothesis they have. The other stuff is just totally implausible at face value, you know, like Clive Prince or something. They'll think, oh well, Leonardo da Vinci made it or something. That just, he
wasn't even alive when
I know they just deny the historical evidence and the carbon dating. They're inconsistent with that and stuff, but yeah, you know. Go ahead.
And the way it appears, a lot of people don't realize that the first person in 1898, Secundo Pia, took a photo of the shroud. And when you just look at it with your naked eye, it's really kind of hard to make out a figure. So it wasn't until seeing the reverse black-white photo that people actually really saw the image. And that's the image that we see today, is that photo and those photos that have been taken of the shroud. And so imagine somebody trying to posit that in the 1300s, somebody's able to come up with an image that you can see that in the reverse in such that way.
Exactly. Yeah. They mostly say it was just like a happy accident and stuff, like it was an unintended side effect. We'll be looking at that in our next shows, because look, I've done the historical evidence for the traditional painting hypothesis, but we've also got the scientific evidence, and that's where you're just going to be destroyed. So yeah, I'm going to be looking at that next time. It'll probably be two shows. The first one I'll focus on the composition of the body and bloodstains, because there's a lot there. And then the other one I'll do, how does the traditional painting hold up in light of the minimal relevant features, things like the negativity, 3D, superficiality. Same thing I did for the proto-photo one, hypothesis there.
Yeah, I like that. And so you're digging into this quite deeply. And so I want to say thank you. And actually, what are you working on now, Dale? Where can we find you next? Are there more Shroud videos on your channel that filling up your channel of late?
So yeah, I mean, I've taken a hiatus from the panel reviews just for a couple months, because I'm rewriting my 300-page Shroud chapter to put in some updates. And then I'm hoping to have that done by September, and then I'm gonna restart up those series. But I do have next week Dr. Andrew Silverman, who's a medical expert on the Shroud, and he's going to be talking about the existence of God, near-death experiences, and also the evidence from the Shroud of Turin. So yeah, that's the next show on the Shroud that I'll be doing.
I got to make sure I add that to my calendar, because that sounds super interesting.
Awesome. Yeah, he's a good guy. He really knows his stuff. So
yeah, great. Well, thank you for coming in today. And everybody, please just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for God's glory. Thank you.
Awesome.
So I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. Thank you, everybody, for coming in here. Please come back. If you like this Shroud video, go ahead and like, subscribe, come again, and all that good stuff.
I am impressed. That was only 20 minutes over the 1 hour mark, so that's pretty good. It wasn't as long as I thought. So.
Yep. It just